Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. I'm Eric Smigel, Chair of Arts Alive at SDSU. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for Art, Storytelling, and Everyday Activism, a presentation featuring our artist in residence, Ms. Zeal Harris, and Chair of Africana Studies, Dr. Adisa Alkebulan. Please note that we are recording this event. We'll begin with the Kumeyaay land acknowledgement. For millennia, the Kumeyaay people have been part of this land. This land has nourished, healed, protected, and embraced them for many generations in a relationship of balance and harmony. As members of the San Diego State community, we acknowledge this legacy. We promote this balance and harmony. We find inspiration from this land, the land of the Kumeyaay. Arts Alive SDSU is dedicated to providing opportunities for students, faculty, and staff at San Diego State University to engage in the arts as an integral part of a comprehensive education that promotes creative research, interdisciplinary collaboration, professional innovation, and personal enrichment on campus and in the community. The Artist in Residence program was designed to enlist a professional visual or performing artist to work with the entire university to celebrate our underrepresented communities. Generously supported by the Division of Student Affairs and Campus Diversity, the residency contributes directly to one of the stated goals of the new strategic plan: to foster and sustain an environment where all students, faculty, staff, and alumni feel welcomed, supported, and valued by the university. A key activity to fulfilling this goal is to produce a broad assortment of compelling artworks that enrich our campuses and reinforce our institution's commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'd like to thank Dr. Luke Wood, Vice President for Student Affairs and Campus Diversity, Dr. Peggy Shannon, Dean of the College of Professional Studies and Fine Arts, and Dr. Monica Casper, Dean of the College of Arts and Letters, for their ongoing support of this program at SDSU. For this inaugural year of the Artist in Residence program, we're fortunate to be working with visual artist Zeal Harris. Based in Los Angeles, Ms. Harris creates what she calls, quote, seductive, caricaturesque, political, urban vernacular story paintings, end quote, that explore new narratives and ancient mythologies of Black history and culture. She earned a Master of Fine Arts degree in studio art from the Otis College of Art and Design, and her work has been exhibited internationally. She is a core member of Black Artists in Los Angeles and recently received commissions for public art projects with the Black Lives Matter organization. At SDSU, Zeal has been meeting with different academic units and student centers to explore issues of identity, social justice, and activism through artistic expression. These conversations will inform her design of an original artwork that will be installed on our San Diego campus in May. For this afternoon's event, Zeal will provide a brief overview of her artwork as it relates to personal storytelling, and everyday activism. And she will be joined by Dr. Adisa Alkebulan, Chair of the Department of Africana Studies. Over the course of the presentation and discussion, feel free to make comments in the chat box. And if you'd like to pose questions to Ms. Harris or Dr. Alkebulan, please post them in the Q&A, which will be moderated toward the end of the hour by MFA student Jamie Pelusi. It's now my pleasure to welcome Ms. Zeal Harris and Dr. Adisa Alkebulan.
Thank you for the warm welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm so happy to be here. I'm so happy that people are in attendance. This Zoom thing is kind of new for events for me. And so I'm just really happy that there are people participating. I know there's so much competition out there in the world of things to do, places to go. So I'm very appreciative of each and every single person. I'm appreciative of Adisa being here as well to join me in this conversation. I do consider this to be a conversation, a dialogue between Adisa and I, and as a chair of Africana Studies, it's a privilege for me to get to talk to someone who's just so respectable, so intelligent, and so accomplished in Africana Studies and, you know, Pan-African activism, to give me a new perspective on the kind of things that I'm doing in my artwork. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and start sharing my screen. We're gonna walk through a slideshow as we have a discussion. All right, I just wanna make sure that, can someone confirm that they can see? I can't breathe.
Yes.
Excellent, all right. So I'm gonna stay silent for a moment as I go through the first few slides. So this is a quote from Claudia Rankine, who's a poet who won a MacArthur Genius Award. And she wrote this poem. We will talk about this a little bit more later through the work. George Floyd's last words, well, some of his last words. So I have a series called Home Remedies for Driving While Black. And most of this artwork is about, as a subject, police violence. And it started with, I didn't intend to make a series. I was just gonna do 4 artworks themed about what happened to 3 or 4 people that I knew. Well, let's say 4 people that I knew who were killed by police. They were all very different kinds of people, very different kinds of backgrounds. It didn't really matter because in the end, they were all unarmed and they were all killed by police. And so the first 2, it was 1998 and 1999. The third one was a neighbor, and that was around 2005 or so, 2006. And the 4th one was a cousin, and it was a cousin of my husband at the time. And so it was right around that time. So as I was thinking about this repetition and pattern, which those are elements, those are principles of design within art. So I feel like an artist, I use pattern and repetition a lot in my work. I'm concerned with this as an aesthetic. It does have an African precedent, and that is it also goes along with rhythm and movement usually, and color. And so in this particular artwork, I had just come back from Haiti, and I was interested in voodoo flags. So there's actually a symbol on this particular artwork that is for Eloah, which is a deity that guards the space in between life and death. And so this artwork features Eric Garner holding an asthma inhaler, as well as cigarettes, which is the initial reason why police were kind of messing with him on the street. And it's also Radio Raheem on the ground, and they both died in very similar fashion, and both in New York. So it was my intention to show how even after 20 years, we're still experiencing these same patterns. These are students that are doing a lay-in protest, and these are spirits who are pouring libations for the dead. Here's a more close-up shot. Summer of 2017, I created this artwork, Liturgical Language of a Free Traveler. I was thinking about quilts, and I was thinking about Harriet Powers' narrative quilts, as well as Ethiopian traditional art paintings that have this kind of like comic, almost like a comic strip format that tells a story. And so a lot of police violence events happened in 2017, and political events. And so I try to capture a lot of what was happening in 2017 as a coming of age story for young people. And also I knew that I wanted to contrast this play and like protest, play and protest, fire and water, warm and cool colors. And so let me move forward with some details. So Adisa, we were talking about this a day or two ago, and you asked me, about what have I created, during this time during COVID. And I said, well, some of what I would create is on themes that I've already worked on. So this is 2017, yet some of the social justice issues are still exactly the same. So we're seeing protesters, we're seeing, the legislative branch or police having clashes with protesters. There's images of Trump, Obama, other politicians, regular people, Sandra Bland. Adisa, what can you say about these patterns and this repetition that's been happening with police violence for how long?
For as long as the police has existed and African people have existed in this country. So for a long time. One of the interesting things about this whole notion of patterns and repetition is that there's very, technology aside, there's very little that we haven't seen. So when we talk about police violence or state sanctioned violence against African people in 2021, we can go all the way back to the 17th century and see the same types of things beginning. The colonial sanctioned violence up through the course of U.S. history. So even though this quilt, I think you said, was in 2017, if you said that you made this quilt yesterday, it would still be very much applicable and it would be believable. Well, not if you actually did it yesterday, but if it was done much more recent than 2017. But let me ask you this, if I could. And it's really two questions, but I'll combine, or I had two questions, but I'll combine them into one. And the question is, how do you see yourself, or how do you define yourself as an artist? And what would you say is the purpose or function of your art?
Ooh, okay, before I answer that question, I just want to say one thing, a couple things about the quilt, and then we can move to that one. So I wanted to say that the quilt features several panels about Corinne Gaines, who was pulled over by police in 2015, I believe, for having a license plate made of cardboard on her car that said "Free Traveler" in marker that she wrote there. And so the police came to respond to a potential domestic violence issue at her home 8 months later, and also issue her a warrant or arrest her for not having shown up in court for that incident of being pulled over with the cardboard license plate. And so what ended up happening that day is, to make the long story short, she ended up in a shootout, and she ended up being killed by the police, and her son was shot, but he didn't die. And so I actually just looked it up last night. I hadn't really followed the story behind it. The last I heard, the parents had not, they were saying that Corinne had some mental health issues. And I also just want to address that this was one of those crazy incidences where she was on Facebook and Instagram posting live while the police were outside her home, and she had a gun and she's there with her child. And then her audience was egging her on to basically fight with the police. So I just wanted to mention that. And the family was awarded $38 million just recently for, I guess it's compensation for her death. And that took a while, a lot of different cases. Then I also wanted to say that I have this interest in Black traditional methods of healing, especially in the United States. And so that took me into the slave era. And so at the same time that I'm telling stories and documenting what's happening, I'm also giving prescriptions from hoodoo, or traditional African-American folk magic, for how to stay protected, or how to get over grieving for a lost one, how to change the outcome of interacting with police. Okay, so your question was, what kind of artist do I see myself as? How do I define myself as an artist? There's a lot of different ways to kind of define myself as an artist depending on the audience. I'm talking with you right now, and you're an Africana Studies chair. So I would say that I see myself in some ways as a griot. And I think you're probably better qualified to tell us what a griot is than I am. So I definitely see myself as a griot. I definitely see myself as someone who is an academic artist, like a researcher, and that I'm documenting things that are happening now, that I'm inventing stories, but still relevant to issues of the African American experiences. So, what can you say about the griot part? You're silent, by the way, you're on mute.
You know, it never fails. I always do that, forget to unmute myself. In any event, so a griot is a number of things. A griot is a historian, a storyteller, a praise singer, a poet, a musician. And how I would connect you and your work with the tradition of being a jelly or a griot, it's also called, is that you're using your voice in the same way that griots used their voice. I mean, your voice is the canvas, your voice is your art. And even though the griot is kind of connected to the African oral tradition, I think in a contemporary sense, the way in which you use your art, it's definitely to tell a story. So you told us a story when you began to share your slides. You are a praise singer in a sense that you are talking about, you know, Corey Gaines. You're talking about all of these other, you know, victims of state-sanctioned violence, and you're doing it in such a way that I mean, you researched the process, you researched the information. So I think in a very real sense and in the contemporary sense that you are definitely a modern day griot as you use your voice to explore the history, culture, and politics of African America.
Thank you so much for that definition that was going to be a whole lot more clear and simple than I think I could have given it for the audience. And for the affirmations, thank you, I appreciate that. When the praise singer one was new for me, so I have to kind of go look that one up. So this artwork is called Un hijo por otro. And pardon me for my gringo Spanish, you know, I just know a few words. And the reason that the title is in Spanish is because this is a hero story that I'm telling, and I'm telling a story about Fedin Santana. And he's a Dominican who recorded the shooting of Walter Scott in the park in Charleston in 2015. So in English, the title is One Son for Another. And the reason I chose this as a title, we see Fedin here with the family of Walter Scott. And the father of Walter Scott said he lost one son, but with Fedin coming forward and, you know, doing the right thing and coming to pay respects to the family, he felt like he got another son for the one he lost. So this was actually shown, it's a series of small paintings, and I don't want to go too much into the sausage making and the secret sauce, but the paintings were painted on fiberless paper as watercolor and mixed media. And then I turned it into a digital artwork in the end and displayed, but it was a series of artwork displayed as one. And I've only displayed it once. So I'm actually, if I show it anytime soon, I'm gonna change how I displayed it. But that's sausage making. So in this particular series of work, I tell the story backwards because at that time, everyone pretty much knew the story of what happened to Walter Scott. So I wanted to make it a little bit more unexpected and change the way people would stand in front of it and read it, knowing that people usually approach artwork that has a story or story panels and text reading from right to left as we normally do on a page. I mean, that's not really something statistically proven, but I was going with that assumption. So we have Fedin here and the different news channels that reported the story. And then Fedin is talking to an attorney here. And, you know, Fedin is a Black Dominican and or Afro-Dominican, I'm not sure which term exactly to use, Afro-Latino, Afro-Descendiente. And one of the things that I found compelling about the real story is his identification with African Americans in America, especially since Dominicans have a reputation for distancing themselves from Black politics, Black history, Africanness. Now that could be a stereotype. I don't really know the truth of it. I kind of feel like that's a conversation a little bit outside of me, but I have witnessed arguments, sometimes playful and sometimes kind of like combative between Dominicans and Haitians, and they live on the same island. So here I show this painting from Howard University, inspired by my Howard University days. And this is basically inspired by the fine art steps. And I went to school with a lot of people who've become famous and are doing really, really, really well right now, but I'm not going to go into all their names. Well, anyway, I was sitting on the steps one day, and this Puerto Rican young woman was arguing with a Black American guy, and he said, whatever, mija, what you doing here anyway? You ain't Black, because Howard University is supposed to be a historically Black college. And she replies, oh, I ain't Black. Mijo negrito, ship stopped in Puerto Rico before a butt to America. And so again, I have done paintings that talk about this sort of Pan-African issues that we need to address in the African diaspora. And so thinking about that, I thought about maybe how Fadine is already aware of some of these things. This is another painting about, it's about government corruption. And it's about the 47 students in Mexico. I think it was 47. I can't remember exactly how many at this point in time now, but they went missing around 2015 or 2016. And it was believed that there was like some, government complicity in how these students who were going to protest a speech that a politician was going to give went missing. And
a time check, we're at 4:25.
Okay, how many minutes remaining?
About 20 for this section.
Okay, so this one is called Women in White Meet at the Wall, because it's about, I wanted to really specifically focus on women and their different methods of protest throughout the diaspora and wearing white during the protest. So there are Cuban women, there are Argentinian women, there are Black American women, there are Mexican women, they're women of the Americas. There's a lot more I can say about that, but I'm trying to keep things short. This is a story, an anecdotal story told to me by someone, and it was about an experience that someone had in Guyana. And it's such a personal story that I don't want to tell the real story, because I wasn't supposed to be told the real story, because they were supposed to be keeping a secret. But the reason I'm mentioning it is that it's set in South America. And when people who are African American look at it, I don't think they assume that it's Caribbean. But Caribbeans know it's Caribbean because they can see the house on the stilts. And so it's just interesting. Again, this is about different types of violence that people of African descent have to face with different kinds of governments for different reasons in the Americas. So going back to Fadine, he actually went to the cops, and he went to the police station, and they kind of just, he said, I have this video of what happened. And they looked at him like, what are you doing here? They didn't say anything. They just looked at him. They didn't ask him to do any paperwork or anything. So he just turned around and left because he felt uncomfortable. So that's why he ended up taking the video to the attorney. He talked to a friend about it before he went to the attorney. He showed him the video of what happened. After Walter Scott was shot in the park and he witnessed it, he went to work, and he worked at a barbershop. Now, I didn't know exactly like what kind of barbershop he worked in or who his friend was. I just read the news and I made guesses, and I put him in Black American environments. And then I was able to get in contact with him, and he said, oh yeah, that's exactly how it happened. I said, I mean, the friend that you talked to was Black American, you work at a Black barbershop? And he said, yes. So I thought that was interesting. So on the wall, you can see how I digitally entered an image, and these are Palestinians who have a sign that says, I can't breathe, justice for Eric Garner at the time. And this is Fadine having witnessed the event of Walter Scott. I actually visited this park on a trip to Charleston, and to like explore Geechee Gullah culture and the legacy of slavery, people enslaved coming through Charleston. So there actually was one African-American cop who was checking the pulse of Walter Scott. And at that time, just as today, we had athletes who were coming forward and showing empathetic protest. So Walter Scott was initially pulled over for having, I don't know, a busted tail light or something like that. Tail light that wasn't working. And then the artwork is actually bookended. This is a layout of how it was exhibited on a wall. So you can see all the smaller pieces in the middle and then bookended by pictures with his family. And that my favorite one of all of them. And here's me working on it. And I'm just going to show like the series continues with some smaller works, again, that have these prescriptive formulas for hoodoo. They're kind of funny and they're bittersweet and they're sad and provocative and moving. Any range of those kind of emotions you can feel by looking at the work. This says, on this holiday, as we depart from your house, please keep us safe from drunk drivers and power drunk popo. And these are the church members doing hoodoo inside the church, which is meant to be funny because, you know, they're supposed to be strictly separating Black folk magic from Christianity. And I'm just going to show these without talking a lot about them because we only have about 2 minutes more. You can go to my website and look at them in more detail and look at the images. And maybe one of the other supporting panelists, they could put my website link on the chat, and that way people can go there and take a look at the work if they like to. Again, these are prescriptive formulas, and I wanted to just talk about the impact of police violence on interpersonal relationships rather than just making artwork about a moment of death or a tragic incident that becomes kind of iconic in a way. I really wanted to talk about everyday average people whose stories we don't hear much about outside of you know, how people actually have to try to be preventative, how it shifts how they live, how they drive, how they work, for the potential for police violence, that is. In this one, the boyfriend is about to leave in the middle of the night because he thinks it's safer to go in the middle of the night since his tags are expired. He doesn't want to be pulled over by police in the middle of the night without any witnesses if something happens to him. And this one is about colorism. So, you know, it's about colorism and police violence and gender and sexuality. And basically the mother who's light skinned with green eyes, is long straight hair, is telling her daughter how to get out of an incident with a white cop. And the daughter's like, you know what? Whatever you tell me is not gonna work because I'm darker skinned and I have nappier hair. I have thicker, woollier hair. It's just not gonna work. So what I wanted to ask you about, Adisa, is how does it make you feel when you see a Black Lives Matter hashtag and Black Lives Matter posters around the world happening right now? People outside of immediate, you know, African Americans, what does this mean? What is this saying to us?
Well, it shows a lot and it says a lot. I mean, one of the things that it says is that people around the world identify with the struggle of African Americans because around the world, people, you know, certainly deal with state repression there. So it is quite easy for them to identify with the plight, so to speak, of African Americans. You know, so it's, you know, it's not a surprise to see, you know, Palestinians, for example, embracing Black Lives Matter. In many ways, the plight of the Palestinians, you know, mirrors the plight of African Americans, but certainly on a much grander scale. I'm not, you know, I don't want to, you know, overstate it. But even in Africa, you know, where you see, you know, many examples of state repression, we also saw protests in France. I mean, even before, you know, 2020, you know, there was a massive uprising in France. So people all around the world can identify with this struggle. But you know, going back to something that I said earlier, it also signifies something that's happened before. You know, so this isn't the first time in world history where people around the world identified with the struggles, the challenges of African Americans. So, you know, whether we're talking about during the enslavement era, during the Civil War and during Reconstruction. And much of the 20th century, the world's eyes in many ways was on the United States. And people can identify the inconsistencies and contradictions with what America says it is, and the narrative that it promotes of itself, or the propaganda that it promotes all around the world, with the reality of it. So when I see people around the world holding Black Lives Matter signs, it reinforces this idea of global solidarity against repression, state repression, and imperialism in general.
Okay, and speaking of you use the word imperialism. So speaking of that, do you think that because the United States is an imperialist nation, that this empowers people seeing the underdog here in the United States fighting against repression? Does this empower them? Does this protect them in some way from directly addressing their own particular governments by taking up our movement in a way?
Well, I think it definitely inspires people. I mean, in the same way that, for example, the African independence movement of the 1950s and 60s inspired African Americans. So it's this, kind of collective Pan-African, movement that has existed for a long period of time. So yes, it's definitely inspirational,
Okay.
if not empowering.
Just another time check. We have about 10 minutes left for this section
Okay.
before the Q&A.
All right. So again, one of the things I'm really excited about the conversations that I've had with Adisa prior to today and today as well, is being able to talk about a lot of different issues in the African diaspora. So Pan-Africanism and Afrocentricity are two of those terms. And so I recently came across something that said that Pan-Africanism is dead. We have organizations like ADOS, for example, here in the United States, that kind of don't really come from a Pan-Africanist point of view to a certain extent. And so I've just wondered, Adisa, is Pan-Africanism dead? How do you respond to that? And then the second part of the question is, how is Pan-Africanism, or is it even relevant to people who are not of African descent?
Well, Pan-Africanism is definitely not dead. And I think, folks who make that claim, they're really saying something about their own political orientation than anything else. I mean, to say that Pan-Africanism is dead is to say that, the African spirit is dead, that our collective call for justice is dead, that Africans all over the world are disconnected. And of course, none of that is true. So again, that statement is more of a reflection of their own, dislocation than anything else. It's a very, kind of nativist position that, many in the so-called ADOS movement have embraced. This idea, that, no one should get, the crumbs of, American white supremacy, but African Americans. So certainly a discussion of ADOS can, be, a much broader kind of conversation, but it's a very nativist position. And in many ways, it's an anti-Black position. It's an anti-African position. And I see it as an example of the oppressed allowing the oppressor to be their teacher. Wow. And that's very troubling and distressing for me. And the second part of your question was the significance or relevance of Pan-Africanism to
Afrocentricity to people who are not of African descent. Is it relevant to them? Is there anything that it can provide them? Should they try to be that?
Well, I mean, Pan-Africanism and Afrocentricity are not, one and the same. They can certainly intersect at times, but they're not the same. Pan-Africanism, I mean, that's really not about anyone but us, right? Afrocentricity is a little different because it's less of a political idea and more of scholarly inquiry. So, for example, and this is why Afrocentricity is certainly relevant to other folks. When you're when you're investigating, when you're studying anything related to African people, African phenomena, African people must be centered and rooted in that, their beliefs, their behaviors, their culture. So if you're involved in that kind of endeavor, even if you're not a person of African descent, you would be well positioned to know something about African culture, African people, so that you could engage in an informed study or investigation of African people. But Pan-Africanism, I mean, that's a more of a political idea, and it's about African people worldwide collectively, working for a common goal, the liberation of African people, worldwide, in a nutshell.
Thank you.
But let me ask you this: how does Pan-Africanism and/or Afrocentricity relate to your work? And I have some other questions too. But how do they relate to your work?
I guess, they're, first of all, they're primary values within my life. So, I would say that I'm very Afrocentric and very Pan-Africanist. And so a lot of my everyday decisions and priorities are formed around those concepts. And so with my art, it could be nothing less. So an example right here is this other project or series that I've started to work on. It's something I'm going to be working on for a long time, which is called Pantheon of Akatas. And Akatas is kind of an offensive word. It's kind of like a slur, an ethnic slur against people who are of African descent. Outside, like, huh? What'd you say?
It's not kind of like a slur. It absolutely is.
So it's used as a slur, kind of a put down of people who are African descent who live outside of Africa. Although I think it was originally meant to describe Nigerians, because the word supposedly comes from Yoruba, which is an ethnic group in Nigeria. And so it means, I've seen various translations, but probably the most common one is something like wild bush animal. So basically, they look Black, but when they come back to Africa or Africans interact with them, they're not really Black anymore. There's some other unexpected thing, like a beast, an animal that they don't know how to deal with. So anyways, my project Pantheon of Akatas, I've chosen the word Pantheon because that is also referencing kind of the religion of Ifa, which also comes from the Yorubas. And so in that, there's a bunch of deities, just like you would have like in Greek mythology, for example, or in Egyptian, ancient, religion. And so each has its role and its energies and its stories, and I consider them to be ancestor stories. So I'm thinking about ancestral mothers, like the very first African women who came to the United States. Like, what were their memories? What were their experiences? How did they relate to each other and survive? What if a group of them were maroons and had to survive in a swamp? So in this particular artwork I have here, Pantheon of Akatas Survivors, I actually have ancestral mothers on the left who are pulling women of the future who are like cyborgs who had a crash from a spaceship. And so the ancestral mothers are trying to save the women of the future, basically. The swamp is inspired by the Great Dismal Swamp, which is near my hometown in Virginia. And that is the site of longest standing Marronage in the United States of America. It's estimated that people may have been maroons inside of there for about 200 years. At different points in time, but consistently over 200 years somewhere within that area. And so basically, in order for them to survive, they have to be Pan-Africanist and they have to employ Afrocentricity. And so it's my opportunity to like research this history and explore things that I never learned in school, and then ask questions and try to create artwork that answers some of the questions, that speculates on some of the history of how they would have survived and how they helped give birth to African-American culture. Where are we with time?
Well, let me also ask you this question. This will be the final question that I ask, because we only have a couple of minutes before we open it up for questions. And it really has to do with that term, Akata. And I just think that you understated the level of offense of that term. I mean, it is a highly offensive term. It is, certainly a pejorative that, is in the same category really as the N-word, despite the fact that a lot of people may have never heard of that term, but it's really, kind of in that area. So I, just kind of wanted to get your, your, thoughts on, kind of, using, what's considered or what is a very, very offensive term to describe, this, this really beautiful, artwork and concept.
Well, I think it's kind of funny. We are different. We're not exactly the same. And there are a lot of Afrocentric, Pan-Africanist Black Americans who actually argue that we are African. We're not, that there's no difference between us and Africans, but there is a lot of difference. And so there's a lot of similarities because, a lot of what we are comes from there, but we are actually a different ethnic group too, with generally speaking, a different set of values and a different cosmology. And I'm saying we have pretty much one here in the United States, whereas Africans have like a zillion different ones because there's so many different ethnic groups, so many different languages. And so we make generalizations when we say African, traditional African culture anyway. But anyway, just to go back to answer your question specifically, Akata, I think to be kind of funny to me, actually. I don't take it personally, but there are some people who take it personally because they think that Africans, the ones who come here to the United States and immigrate, they may be coming from a social class that's a little higher than the average person in the country that they're from. And so when they come here, they're coming sometimes from the middle class or the elite class of their country. And so there have been, and there still are, some debates about whether or not there's conflict between how much of it is conflict and how much is harmony and how much is conflict between African Americans that were born here and been here for generations versus African Africans who are coming here as immigrants in the last 1 and 2 generations, basically since the 60s. So did I answer your question?
You gave an answer.
I mean, I just gave my own personal answer, but I acknowledge that there are other people who take more offense to the term.
Right. Okay. I certainly, probably offline we'll have some follow-ups and we can continue that conversation, but I think we've reached the end of this portion of the program.
Okay, well, I'm just going to rush through the last couple images. This is just a fun drawing I did of Harriet Tubman. I liked it because it showed that she's also an actress, not just a bad woman, a good bad woman. She actually is acting humble here. And I imagine that just this alone, her ability to be a great actress was what enabled her to survive without being caught through so many journeys back and forth, saving people and also being, intelligence for the US Army during the Civil War. And so I just wanted to end off with saying that, Black History Month, one of the things I have to do for SDSU is create a permanent artwork. And so I've decided to focus on Black pioneers of San Diego. And I know the term pioneers has its own controversy, but I just wanted to show a couple images of me doing research in the area. And then recently I went to San Basilio de Palenque. And so one of the things I do, again, motivated by Afrocentrism and Pan-Africanism, is go visit highly charged historical places within the African diaspora where people resisted enslavement and set up communities. And so I recently went to one in Colombia. And there's some images from that trip. And this was 3 weeks ago. And I'm gonna just end off there. That's my website, if people wanna go there and visit. And that's a painting that, one of my first paintings that people still love, is one of my favorite paintings. I was definitely thinking about Jacob Lawrence when I made it. So I think we could go into the Q&A.
Yeah, we have a couple questions and just another call for folks. If you have a question, feel free to put it into the chat or the Q&A function. So the first one, I'll send it to you, but it says, you mentioned the parallels between your art and storytelling, especially with regard to repetition. Wondering if you've explored a connection with your art and dance/movement, which has some of the same principles of repetition, amplification of call and response.
I wonder if that's someone I personally know who asked that question, that knows that I'm a social dancer also. So I do several different kinds of social dance. I've even taken dance lessons in Cuba just to make sure I was learning the dances correctly that I had been learning in the United States for like years. So, and I think that my level of Afrocentricity and Pan-Africanism definitely increased. They went to a deeper level with learning how to do partner dances from Latin America, specifically Cuban salsa. I would say that was like that was like definitely like my entrance into a lot of African-based religion, as well as my trip to Haiti as well. So let's see. Yes, yes, I do think about some of the concepts, but I think about them. Yes, I do think about them. I even think about including more figures that look like they're dancing. This book right here, What Makes That Black, has a lot of aesthetic principles of expressive culture that are relevant to art. And the author is a dancer. She's coming from a dance background, but she uses a lot of fine art examples, and I find it highly relevant. And so, yes, repetition, pattern, movement, spacing, purpose of making the artworks, symbolism, function. There's a lot of different ways that are African principles at work in my work that I'm aware of.
Nice. The next question asks, can you talk more about African-American Marronage and how it shows up in your work, or Marronage?
They're gonna have to follow that series, the Pantheon of Akata series, because I've started to make it, and it's something that I plan to be making for a long time, like at least a decade, so at minimum. And so I would say if you want a book, I can type something on to the chat that you could go look up. It's a book edited and put together by Diop. Her last name is Diop. Sylvia Diop, is that her name? Do you know Adisa? She's a French historian who's with the Schomburg right now, or at least the last time I checked. Sylvia, I think it's Sylvia A. Diop. She's a historian, and she has some really great books that she is the editor of, and one of them is called American, forgot the name of it right now, it's over there, I can't go get it. And also another one that she put together on West African strategies for fighting the slave trade, which I highly recommend. Any other questions?
Yeah. So the next question asks, how should white people refer to your artworks that contain slurs?
They don't have to say it, they can just look at it.
Yeah.
Care to elaborate?
All right, and we've had, there's a lot of affirming comments, people really enjoying your work. And someone, just to state one, someone said a fun drawing, in quotation marks, of Tubman. Someone say that's an amazing piece of work and skill showing one side of a phenomenal woman.
Oh.
And oh, go ahead.
I was going to say that a department chair that I'm well aware of, who's an African scholar, African-American scholar, has just commented, he really despises the use of the term Akata and feels that it should be ended and it shouldn't go forward. And I know that I'm using a provocative term in some circles. Other people have no idea what it means, and I know that it does bring into play various conversations about the similarities and differences between Africans who are immigrants here in the United States and African Americans. So.
Yeah, and I think that that's a very important, conversation for African people to have, African Americans and continental Africans, for sure. But one thing that, perhaps, you can think about, or we can think about, is that the term Akata is a very, anti-Pan-African term. And, I don't know if you kind of made, that kind of consideration But you, if not, you might want to, just kind of, consider that.
I made it. I mean, it's the same way that feminists embrace, some feminists, not all, embrace the term bitch. It's the same way that LGBT activists sometimes embrace the term fag. It's the same way that some Black activists who are super Black conscious still say the N-word. So I'm very much aware that some people like have fun with the words and some people are super serious and super conservative with the use of the word. And there's a whole maybe you can help me out with it because I can't remember the name. There's like a whole term and concept for empowerment philosophy when it comes to these kind of terms and like flipping them and reversing them and then, giving it a new context and re-empowering with the use of the term.
Right.
I see that there's some questions directly on the chat, but I'm not sure if I should address them. I mean, Jamie, since you're kind of curating the questions.
Yeah, I can help with that. So this next one, I guess could be for both of you, but how does Zeal's work specifically speak to issues that are being discussed university-wide at SDSU?
Did you want to answer that?
No, I'd rather you answer that, Adisa.
Oh, okay. Well, I think that her work, obviously has a, national and a, kind of global framework. And SDSU students, of course, don't live in a bubble, so her work is very, very relevant in an international sense, in a national sense. Her work preceded the infamous 2020, the year of, pandemic and protests, so it's interesting that, her work becomes kind of a, I don't want to say vindication because it's always, been here, but, her work has been very much about the very things that were put at the forefront in 2020 that we're still talking about today. So in that context, I mean, it's very relevant to SDSU, our students. Our students have always sought to have a sacred space at San Diego State. Africana studies, served that in a, kind of academic, theoretical sense, interpersonal as far as mentoring. Now the Black Resource Center, kind of serves as that sacred physical space. And I think that Zeal's work, fits right into, if we're talking about San Diego State, it would fit, right into, the aesthetics of our students, the cultural and political analyses that our students are engaged in. So I think that's why her work, or that's how her work is relevant to San Diego State.
Thank you. I also just tried to respond to a question from Seth Malios on the chat and says, what are my initial thoughts about how to portray Julian's American Mutant artistically? And so my response is basically that I'm as intrigued with Nathan Harrison, the Robinsons who established the hotel, and the Coleman brothers, kind of in that order. The Coleman brothers and their impact on the gold rush of Julian City. And so that will go into the artwork that I'm making for the campus. I think it's really cool to focus on a couple of individuals who are not in relationships, as well as a loving couple. And just to address colorism, I was super impressed with the wife in the Robinson couple, because I just thought that she was so incredibly beautiful and had such dark chocolate, beautiful skin and an African look. And I was amazed at how she helped to, she and her husband were a power couple and accomplished what they did. It seemed to me that, well, I've read an article recently about, because I'm interested in DNA, especially African-American DNA and genealogy. And I have been working on these projects for the past few years. I came across an article that basically said that a lot of the African-Americans still in the South are darker skinned and have more African DNA than African-Americans who migrated out of the South during the migration era. And that's because they have more privilege, being lighter skinned, having smoother hair, or access to resources. And so with the San Diego Black residents, I don't know all of them, but a lot of them are light skinned. They do appear to be mixed. And again, I was impressed that Nathan Harrison and and the Robinson wife were both very, very dark skinned and did very well for themselves. So we need to make sure we end on time is what I just saw on the chat.
So let's invite Eric back.
Yes. I definitely want to thank everyone in case I don't get time to do that personally.
Thank you very much. Let's all thank Ms. Zeal Harris and Dr. Adisa Al-Kibalan for a stimulating presentation and conversation. Thank you very much. We're very grateful. I would also like to acknowledge the outstanding work of Elizabeth Allison, the Public Affairs and Communications Specialist for Arts Alive SDSU, and Jamie Pelusi, graduate student extraordinaire and timekeeper from the School of Art and Design, both of whom have been essential in delivering the Artist in Residence program this year. If you would like to schedule a session with Zeal for your class or your center, please follow the link that will appear in the chat box. And we also hope you'll attend a virtual celebration that we're preparing for when she unveils her original artwork in May. Stay tuned for that announcement. You are also welcome, of course, to follow Arts Alive SDSU on social media with our username @ArtsAliveSDSU, which will also appear in the chat, to check into all of our upcoming events. Finally, we will be emailing a survey to everyone who registered for this event, and we would be grateful for your response as it will help us improve our programming. For those whose questions didn't get addressed in this session, we'll collect them and get them to Zeal and get back to you with a response.
Oh, I really appreciate that.
So thank you again, everyone, for joining us this afternoon, and have a great evening.
Thank you, Adisa, for joining us too. Ready.
You're welcome.
Bye.
Thank you so much.